Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Pike County, Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. On the morning of March 15th, 1906, 23 school children and their teacher, Margaret Ashford, descended into the depths of Blackwood mine for what was intended to be an educational visit to observe the workings of a coal mine that sustained their small Appalachian community. 2 days later, only 4 children emerged from a ventilation shaft half a mile from the main entrance, their clothes torn, covered in limestone dust and coal residue, speaking in fragments about wrong tunnels and strange singing in the darkness. The remaining 19 children and their teacher vanished without trace into the subterranean labyrinth, their fate becoming one of the most perplexing disappearances in American history. No bodies were recovered during the extensive search that followed, no evidence of cave-in or gas exposure sufficient to explain the mass vanishing, only scattered lanterns and personal effects found in chambers that, according to official mine maps, should not have existed. The Blackwood mine was sealed permanently within weeks of the incident, its owner, Victor Blackwood, paying settlements to grieving families while refusing to discuss what surveys had revealed about the mine's connection to unmapped cavern systems beneath Pike County. For generations, the disappearance of the Ashford School Group has haunted eastern Kentucky, a mystery compounded by the contradictory testimonies of the 4 survivors who lived the remainder of their lives marked by trauma they could never fully articulate. Their fragmented accounts speak of passages that shifted in the darkness, of their teacher leading them deeper following sounds only she could hear, of voices that sang with words that weren't quite human, memories so disturbing that one survivor would take her own life, another would be institutionalized, and the remaining 2 would spend decades refusing to speak of what they witnessed in those underground chambers. What began as a progressive educator's attempt to provide practical learning for her students became instead a descent into an ancient darkness that swallowed 19 children whole, leaving only questions that echo still through the sealed mine shafts and in the nightmares of those who survived to bear witness to something their young minds could never fully comprehend or convey. Pike County in eastern Kentucky was coal country in 1906, its steep hillsides scarred by the constant extraction of black carbon that powered America's Industrial Revolution. The town of Harlan Springs, with its population of approximately 800 souls, existed solely because of the coal seams that ran like dark veins through the mountains, and every family's fortune was tied to the success or failure of the mining operations that dominated the landscape. The Blackwood Mining Company had established itself as the primary employer in the region since its founding in 1889 by the brothers Victor and Samuel Blackwood, entrepreneurs from Pennsylvania who recognized the potential wealth buried beneath Kentucky's ancient mountains. The company town they built around their primary operation featured rows of identical frame houses for miners' families, a company store that extended credit against future wages, a small Methodist church whose pews filled each Sunday with cold, dusty congregants, and the one-room schoolhouse where Margaret Ashford would eventually teach. Mining in 1906 was a brutal occupation that claimed lives with mechanical regularity through cave-ins, explosions of methane gas, and the slow suffocation of black lung disease that turned strong men into wheezing shadows. The Blackwood mine itself had already developed a reputation among workers for being particularly treacherous, with its main coal seams intersecting with natural limestone caverns that created unexpected voids and unstable sealing conditions. Miners spoke in hushed tones about the deep sections where the coal gave way to white limestone chambers, where sounds echoed strangely, and veteran workers refused to venture alone, claiming the darkness there felt different somehow, older and more oppressive than the ordinary blackness of coal tunnels. The social structure of Harlan Springs reflected the harsh realities of extraction capitalism, with mine supervisors and company officials living in larger homes on the hillside above town, while miners and their families crowded into company housing near the mine entrance, their lives regulated by the steam whistle that called shifts and marked the passage of days. Into this world of coal dust and controlled desperation came those who sought to improve conditions through education, believing that knowledge might offer the next generation alternatives to following their fathers into the earth, though few could have imagined how literally and terribly that earth would claim its due from the children of Harlan Springs. The Harlan Springs School occupied a simple wooden building at the intersection of Main and Elm Streets, its single room serving children aged 6 through 14 in the manner typical of rural education in early 20th century America. Margaret Ashford had arrived in Pike County in the autumn of 1903, a 24-year-old graduate of the State Normal School in Richmond, filled with progressive ideals about education and determined to bring modern teaching methods to the isolated communities of Appalachia. Her credentials were impressive for a rural teacher of the era, including certification in natural sciences and geography, and she had specifically requested placement in a mining community, believing that children of industrial workers deserved the same quality education as their urban counterparts. The student body of 23 children represented nearly every mining family in Harlan Springs, their ages ranging from 6-year-old Lily Ashford, the teacher's own niece, whom she had taken in after her sister's death in childbirth, to 14-year-old Samuel Pierce, whose intelligence Miss Ashford had recognized and nurtured despite his father's intention that he begin work in the mine at 16. School records meticulously maintained by Miss Ashford and preserved in the Pike County archives reveal a dedicated educator who knew each student's strengths and struggles, who conducted classes in practical mathematics using examples from mining operations, who taught geography by having students map the creeks and hollows around their homes, and who believed that direct observation of the industrial processes that shaped their community would inspire her students to pursue education beyond the elementary level. The community initially viewed her methods with suspicion common to insular populations, but her obvious care for the children and her respectful integration into town life had won over most skeptics by 1906, with parents noting improvements in their children's reading and arithmetic skills. Margaret Ashford's journal, discovered decades after her disappearance, reveals a woman who saw education as more than rote memorization, who believed that understanding the scientific principles behind coal formation and extraction would give her students power over their circumstances, who wrote extensively about her plans to arrange visits to various industrial sites to complement classroom learning, never knowing that her progressive philosophy would lead her charges into a darkness from which most would never return. The Blackwood mine had been carved into Jenkins Mountain beginning in 1889, following a particularly rich seam of bituminous coal that descended at a 20-degree angle into the earth before leveling out some 300 feet below the surface. The mine's reputation among local workers was decidedly mixed, for while the Blackwood Company paid slightly better wages than competing operations and maintained reasonably safe working conditions in the main tunnels, there persisted disturbing stories about the deeper sections where the coal seam had broken through into natural caverns. Previous incidents marred the mine's safety record, including a catastrophic cave-in in 1892 that killed 7 men whose bodies were never recovered, a gas leak in 1899 that suffocated 4 workers in a poorly ventilated section, and most recently, in 1904, when 3 miners simply vanished during a night shift, their tools found abandoned in a tunnel that, according to foreman Jacob Brennan, had been solid rock the previous day. Victor Blackwood, the elder brother who managed the business operations, publicly attributed these incidents to worker carelessness and the inherent dangers of mining, but his brother Samuel, who oversaw the technical aspects of extraction, had privately commissioned geological surveys that revealed the disturbing extent of natural cavern systems intersecting with their mine workings. Jacob Brennan, the mine foreman since 1901, maintained detailed maps of the tunnels and strictly forbade workers from entering certain sections he marked as unstable, though miners whispered that stability wasn't the real concern, but rather something about those deep areas that unnerved even veteran workers. Testimonies collected after the 1906 incident spoke of strange occurrences underground, including tools that moved overnight, voices heard in abandoned tunnels, and most disturbing, the discovery of carved symbols in chambers that predated the mine's establishment, markings that suggested human presence in these depths long before the first miners broke through. The mine's unusual geology, with its honeycomb of limestone caverns beneath the coal measures, created acoustic phenomena that veteran miners found deeply unsettling, particularly the way sounds would carry from impossible distances or directions, leading to strict rules about maintaining contact with partners and never working alone in the deeper sections, rules that would prove tragically inadequate when applied to a group of curious schoolchildren led by a teacher who believed that scientific understanding could dispel superstitious fears. Margaret Ashford's proposal to the Harlan Springs School Board in January 1906 represented the culmination of months of planning and consideration about how best to prepare her students for lives that would inevitably be shaped by the coal industry that dominated their region. Her vision for practical education through industrial field trips was outlined in a detailed document preserved in the Pike County Board of Education archives, arguing that direct observation of mining operations would reinforce lessons in geology, chemistry, physics, and mathematics, while also potentially inspiring students to pursue technical education that could lead to positions as engineers or supervisors rather than common laborers. Initial resistance from parents reflected both protective instincts and the deep-seated belief that the mine was no place for children, with several mothers particularly vocal in their opposition, citing the dangerous conditions and the impropriety of exposing young girls to the rough environment of industrial labor. The surprising support from Victor Blackwood himself proved decisive in overcoming community objections and, as the mine owner saw an opportunity to demonstrate the modern safety measures his company had implemented and perhaps to cultivate favorable impressions among the next generation of potential workers. His endorsement came with specific conditions, including that the visit occur during daylight hours when the main shift was working, that experienced foreman Jacob Brennan personally guide the group, that they remain in the upper levels of the mine where ventilation was optimal, and that each child have written parental permission, requirements that seemed reasonable and safety-conscious at the time. The preparation for the visit consumed several weeks as Miss Ashford integrated mining-related content into her lessons, teaching students about coal formation over geological time, the engineering principles of shaft construction, and the importance of proper ventilation in preventing gas accumulation, determined that her students would enter the mine as informed observers rather than mere spectators. Permission slips were distributed and collected, with only 2 families ultimately refusing to allow their children to participate, decisions that would seem prescient in hindsight. While the selected 23 students spent the days before the visit in excited anticipation, viewing the upcoming descent as an adventure that would distinguish them from children in other communities who learned only from books rather than direct experience of the industrial sublime that shaped their world. The morning of March 15th, 1906, dawned unusually warm for March in the Kentucky mountains, with a heavy overcast that pressed down on Harlan Springs like a gray wool blanket and gave the air an oppressive quality that several witnesses would later recall as ominous. Margaret Ashford arrived at the schoolhouse early to make final preparations, checking her list of participating students and the supplies they would need, including notebooks for observations, pencils secured with string to prevent dropping, and lunch pails that would sustain them through what was planned as a 4-hour educational excursion. By 8:30, the children had assembled, their excitement palpable as they chattered about the adventure ahead, many wearing their Sunday clothes as if for a special occasion, their faces scrubbed clean, in ironic preparation for entering the grimy environment of a working coal mine. The group departed the schoolhouse at 9:15, walking in organized pairs along Main Street as townspeople paused their morning activities to watch the unusual procession, several calling out good wishes or warnings to be careful, their voices carrying a note of unease about children entering the underground realm typically reserved for adult men. The 2-mile walk to the Blackwood mine followed the wagon road that paralleled Blackwater Creek, the children's voices echoing off the hillsides as they sang songs Miss Ashford had taught them, their enthusiasm undimmed by the steepening grade as they approached the industrial complex carved into the mountainside. Witnesses who saw them pass included Martha Hopper, who was hanging laundry, and noted that Miss Ashford seemed somewhat distracted, pausing several times to look back as if counting her charges, and elderly Samuel Guffey, who sat on his porch every morning and would testify that he felt a strange reluctance to wave back at the children, overwhelmed by what he described as a premonition that he was watching a funeral procession. The arrival at the mine at 10:45 was recorded in the official log kept at the mine entrance, the watchman noting 23 children and 1 adult, all signed in properly according to company regulations, before they were met by foreman Jacob Brennan, who appeared unusually somber for what should have been a routine public relations exercise. The reconstruction of the group's descent into Blackwood Mine relies heavily on the testimony of the 4 surviving children and the physical evidence found during the subsequent search, painting a picture of an excursion that began according to plan before deviating into regions that should have been off-limits. The main shaft entrance stood 15 feet high and 12 feet wide, reinforced with heavy timber frames that created a geometric portal into the mountain's interior, where electric lights, strung along the ceiling, provided illumination for the first several hundred feet before giving way to the carbide lamps that miners carried into the deeper workings. Jacob Brennan distributed safety equipment, including hard leather caps with mounted lamps for each child, and demonstrated how to adjust the flame for optimal light while conserving carbide, his manner professional but noticeably tense, according to survivor Samuel Pierce's later testimony. The initial descent followed the main haulage way, where narrow-gauge rail tracks carried cars loaded with coal from the working faces to the surface, the children marveling at the transformation from daylight to artificial illumination to the profound darkness that pressed against the edges of their lamp beams. Margaret Ashford maintained strict discipline during these early stages, requiring students to stay in paired lines and to touch the walls only when instructed, though survivor Ruth Holloway would later recall that their teacher seemed increasingly distracted as they descended, occasionally stopping to listen to sounds none of the children could hear. The planned route would have taken them to the primary working face, approximately 1,200 feet from the entrance and 200 feet below surface, where they could observe miners extracting coal and loading it into cars, but at some point after passing the second ventilation door, Brennan led them into an older section of the mine. According to his son, Thomas, one of the survivors, his father had received a whispered instruction from Miss Ashford about showing the children the cathedral room, a large natural cavern the miners had discovered years earlier, where the acoustics created an almost musical resonance. The deviation from the approved route would prove fatal, leading the group away from areas where miners were actively working and into sections of the mine that connected with natural cave systems, passages that appeared on no official map and that experienced miners avoided for reasons they could rarely articulate beyond saying that the darkness there felt hungry. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the school group should have been emerging from the mine shaft after their educational tour, the only activity at the surface was the routine changing of shifts as day workers descended, and the few night maintenance crew prepared for their duties. The weather had grown increasingly oppressive, with the threatened rain beginning as a light mist that beaded on metal surfaces and made the mine entrance look like a mouth-breathing fog. Though underground, the temperature remained constant, and the group's delay initially caused no alarm. By 3 o'clock, Margaret Ashford's absence from the surface began to generate concern among the mine officials, particularly since Brennan was known for his punctuality and adherence to safety protocols, and why that, leading the shift supervisor to send a runner into the main tunnel to check on the group's whereabouts. The runner returned 20 minutes later, reporting no sign of the school party in any of the active working areas, though he had found a child's dropped pencil near the entrance to the old workings, a discovery that caused the first real alarm as those sections were strictly off-limits. The mine whistle shrieked its emergency pattern at 3:30, 3 long blasts followed by 3 short, calling all available men to the surface and alerting the town that something had gone wrong, the sound echoing off the mountains and reaching the schoolhouse where parents had begun to gather, expecting their children's return. Word spread through Harlan Springs with the terrible efficiency of small-town communication networks, and by 4 o'clock a crowd of anxious parents and relatives had assembled at the mine entrance, their questions growing more desperate as it became clear that no one had seen the children since they descended 5 hours earlier. The first search team entered the mine at 4:15, consisting of 6 experienced miners who knew the passages well and carried extra lamps and rope, their mission to trace the most likely route Brennan would have taken and bring the group safely to the surface. As darkness fell over Pike County and rain began in earnest, more search teams prepared to descend while women organized coffee and food for what was becoming clear would be a long vigil, though none yet suspected they were waiting for children who had already passed beyond the reach of any search party. The discovery came at dawn on March 16th when William Hartley, a farmer checking his fence lines, heard what he thought were wounded animals crying near an old ventilation shaft on his property, half a mile from the main Blackwood mine entrance. What he found instead were 4 children, barely recognizable under layers of coal dust and limestone powder, their clothes torn and their exposed skin scraped raw, huddled together at the shaft's mouth like creatures driven from their burrow by flood or fire. Samuel Pierce, the eldest at 12, was attempting to shield the younger children, Ruth Holloway, age 10, Thomas Brennan, 8 years old and the foreman's son, and little Lily Ashford, only 6, and her teacher aunt's special charge, though all 4 appeared to be in states of severe shock and exposure. Hartley's wife wrapped them in quilts while he rode hard to town for the doctor and to alert the search parties that some at least had been found, though the children's condition, when Dr. Marcus Webb examined them, raised more questions than it answered. Their physical state showed clear evidence of having been underground for at least 30 hours with dehydration, hypothermia from the constant 50-degree temperature of the deep mine, and numerous abrasions consistent with scrambling through narrow passages, yet they showed no evidence of carbon monoxide exposure that might indicate they had been trapped by bad air. The initial statements taken from the children were fragmentary and often contradictory, with Samuel Pierce managing only to repeat that Miss Ashford had told them to run when the passages started closing, Ruth Holloway speaking of singing that came from the walls themselves, Thomas Brennan insisting that his father had tried to mark their path but the marks kept disappearing, and Lily Ashford remaining completely mute, her eyes wide with a terror that no 6-year-old should have known. Dr. Webb's medical notes, discovered in his papers after his death in 1931, included observations not in his official report, describing how all 4 children had limestone dust in their lungs, indicating prolonged exposure to cave air rather than coal mine atmosphere, and more disturbing, what appeared to be defensive wounds on their hands, as if they had fought against something trying to hold them, though what that might have been in the abandoned depths of the mine, he could not speculate. The massive search operation that followed the discovery of the 4 survivors represented one of the largest coordinated rescue efforts in Kentucky mining history, eventually involving over 200 volunteers from Pike County and surrounding communities who descended into the Blackwood mine despite the dangers. The search was organized with military precision under the direction of State Mine Inspector Charles Donaldson, who arrived from Frankfort on March 17th with maps and surveying equipment to coordinate the systematic exploration of every accessible tunnel and chamber. Teams of experienced miners were assigned to different sections of the mine complex, marking their routes with chalk and maintaining contact through a system of calls and responses, though several teams reported that sounds behaved strangely in certain areas, with voices seeming to come from multiple directions or echoing long after they should have faded. The discovery of evidence began almost immediately, with search teams finding abandoned lanterns in the vast limestone chamber known as the Cathedral Room, their carbide reserves exhausted, suggesting the group had spent considerable time there, and more puzzling, the remains of their lunch meal spread out as if for a picnic, though only partially consumed. The absence of bodies in areas where the children should have been, if they had succumbed to gas or become lost, raised troubling questions, as did the discovery of children's shoes scattered along a tunnel that appeared on no official mine map, a passage that seemed to have been recently exposed by some geological shift. Margaret Ashford's leather satchel containing her teaching materials was discovered on March 18th in what searchers described as an impossible location, a sealed side tunnel that required breaking through a wall of fallen rock to access, though the satchel itself showed no damage and appeared to have been placed there deliberately rather than lost in a panic. The search teams also reported finding peculiar markings on the walls in several locations, symbols that predated the mine's operations and seemed to have been carved into the limestone itself, though whether these had any connection to the missing children remained unclear. By March 20th, dangerous levels of methane gas detected in the deeper sections forced the official suspension of search operations, leaving 19 children and their teacher unaccounted for, their fate seemingly swallowed by the mountain itself. The testimonies of the 4 survivors, taken by Pike County Sheriff William Masterson in the days following their recovery, presented a confusion of contradictory accounts that frustrated investigators trying to establish a clear timeline of events underground. Samuel Pierce, who as the eldest survivor might have been expected to provide the most coherent account, claimed that the group had followed Miss Ashford into a series of unmarked tunnels after she heard what she described as children singing somewhere in the darkness, though no mining operations had ever used child labor in that section of the mine. His testimony described passages that seemed to change configuration, doorways that appeared solid when approached from one direction but opened into vast chambers from another, and most disturbing, his insistence that at several points he saw other figures in the darkness beyond their lamplight, figures that moved wrong and whose faces were hard to perceive clearly. Ruth Holloway's account focused on the sounds they encountered in the deep sections of the mine, which she described as voices calling their names, but with pronunciations that seemed to come from throats not designed for human speech, and her repeated assertion that Miss Ashford had begun responding to these calls, leading the group ever deeper, despite the children's growing terror. Thomas Brennan, perhaps influenced by loyalty to his father, maintained that Foreman Brennan had tried desperately to lead them back to the surface, but that the passages they had entered through were no longer there, solid rock where open tunnels should have been, forcing them to seek other routes that led only to deeper and more confusing chambers. Young Lily Ashford remained mute for 3 weeks after the incident, and when she finally spoke, it was only to ask when her aunt would come back from the dark place, suggesting a child's understanding that wherever Margaret Ashford had gone, it was beyond the reach of normal search and rescue. The official report compiled from these testimonies concluded with unusual candor that the accounts were too contradictory and fantastical to establish criminal negligence, recommending instead that the deaths be attributed to misadventure in dangerous conditions, though Sheriff Masterson's private notes revealed his belief that the children had experienced something genuinely traumatic that their minds could not properly process or articulate. The decision to permanently seal Blackwood Mine came from Victor Blackwood himself in April 1906, justified publicly as a safety measure to prevent future tragedies, but rumored to be motivated by discoveries made during the search that the mine owner refused to discuss. The financial implications of closing a profitable mining operation were considerable, yet Blackwood moved with unusual haste to settle lawsuits from the bereaved families, paying amounts that exceeded typical wrongful death compensations of the era and requiring in exchange that families sign agreements not to pursue further investigation into the incident. The mine entrance was first sealed with heavy timber barriers, then dynamited to cause a controlled collapse of the shaft, and finally filled with concrete mixed with iron filings to prevent any possibility of future entry, measures that seemed excessive for a simple safety closure. Jacob Brennan, whose son Thomas was among the survivors, resigned his position immediately after the mine's closure and left Kentucky entirely, relocating to Colorado, where he reportedly never spoke of his years at Blackwood Mine or the fate of the 19 souls lost under his supervision. The economic impact on Harlan Springs was immediate and severe, as the mine had employed nearly half the town's adult male population, forcing families to relocate to other mining communities or attempt to scratch out livings from the thin mountain soil. Within a year of the incident, all 4 survivor families had left Pike County, their departures hastened by the way other children avoided the survivors and the whispers that followed them about what they might have seen in the depths that left them so profoundly changed. The Blackwood Mining Company dissolved its Kentucky operations entirely by 1908, with Victor Blackwood retiring to Pennsylvania, where he lived as a recluse until his death in 1919, leaving papers that his lawyers were instructed to burn unread. The town of Harlan Springs gradually emptied as families sought opportunities elsewhere, leaving behind empty houses and a one-room schoolhouse that no teacher would accept assignment to, until by 1920 only a few elderly residents remained to tend graves and remember when 23 children walked into a mountain and only 4 walked out. The subsequent lives of the 4 children who survived the Blackwood mine incident traced trajectories of tragedy and torment that suggested their escape from the physical darkness had not freed them from psychological shadows. Samuel Pierce relocated with his family to Cincinnati, Ohio, where his father found work in a factory, but school records indicate that Samuel never recovered his previous academic promise, suffering from what teachers described as periodic fugue states, where he would stop mid-task and stare at corners of rooms as if seeing something others could not. His suicide in 1923 at age 29 was discovered by his landlady, who found him hanging in his rented room along with dozens of sketches depicting tunnel systems that seemed to extend impossibly in all directions, and a note that simply read that they were calling him back and he couldn't resist anymore. Ruth Holloway's path led to the Central Kentucky Asylum for the Insane in 1915 after years of what her family described as increasing hysteria, including claims that she could hear the missing children singing to her at night and her compulsive digging of holes in the yard that she insisted were escape routes for those still trapped below. The asylum records detail a patient who alternated between periods of lucidity where she would beg not to be left alone in the dark and episodes of catatonic withdrawal where she would curl into a fetal position and whisper names of the missing children in alphabetical order. Thomas Brennan appeared to achieve the most normal adjustment of the survivors, enlisting in the army in 1917 and serving with distinction in France, until his disappearance during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, though his commanding officer reported that Brennan had voluntarily entered a German tunnel complex during the battle and never emerged. His body never recovered despite extensive searches after the armistice. Lily Ashford, the youngest survivor, was raised by relatives in Virginia who reported that she never spoke of the incident directly, but would sometimes wake screaming about the lady in the walls who wore her aunt's face but wasn't her aunt, developing into a seemingly well-adjusted adult who became a teacher like her lost aunt, though she insisted on only teaching in schools with many windows and refused any position that required her to enter a basement. The unexpected discovery in 1952 of Margaret Ashford's diary changed the understanding of the Blackwood mine incident from a simple, if tragic mining accident to something far more disturbing and premeditated. A University of Kentucky geological survey team studying abandoned mine sites for potential hazards used new drilling technology to access previously sealed chambers, breaking through into a limestone cavity approximately 500 feet below the surface, where they found personal effects that had somehow remained preserved in the dry cave atmosphere. The diary, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind a natural shelf formation, was authenticated by handwriting experts who compared it to Margaret Ashford's teaching records with entries spanning from January to March 14, 1906, the day before the fatal excursion. Her January entries revealed that she had been conducting solo explorations of the mine during winter weekends, drawn by what she described as acoustic phenomena in the deeper chambers that seemed to follow mathematical patterns she was attempting to decode. By February, Her writings took on an increasingly obsessive quality as she documented hearing what she interpreted as responses to her presence, describing them as articulate sounds that resembled singing but followed tonal progressions unknown to Western music. Her final entries before the field trip revealed that Victor Blackwood had discovered her unauthorized explorations, but rather than forbidding them, had encouraged her investigations, providing her with maps of sections of the mind that weren't supposed to exist, and expressing his belief that she had discovered something significant. The most chilling entry, dated March 14th, read in part that Victor had finally shown her the true extent of the passages beneath Blackwood Mine, chambers that predated any human mining by millennia, where the walls bore carvings that seemed to depict celestial configurations unlike any known to astronomy, and where sounds emerged from depths that no light had ever penetrated. She wrote of her conviction that exposing her students to these wonders would revolutionize their understanding of the world, though she admitted to dreams where voices that weren't quite voices promised to teach her songs that human throats were never meant to sing. The investigation triggered by the diary's discovery revealed a pattern of deception and hidden knowledge within the Blackwood family's mining operations that extended far beyond the 1906 incident. Researchers examining corporate records found evidence that Victor and Samuel Blackwood had deliberately sought out sites where local folklore spoke of haunted caves or places where people disappeared, or acquiring mineral rights for pennies on the dollar from owners eager to divest themselves of cursed property. Similar incidents had occurred at Blackwood-owned mines in West Virginia in 1898, where an entire shift of 13 miners had vanished without a trace from a section that intersected with a natural cave system, their equipment found arranged in a careful pattern, but no bodies ever recovered. Documents discovered in Victor Blackwood's estate included correspondence with various occult societies of the late 19th century, expressing his belief that certain geological formations served as conduits to what he termed parallel spaces that existed alongside but separate from our reality. Mining engineers who reviewed surveys of the Blackwood mine noted that the operation had deliberately deviated from coal seams to explore limestone caverns that offered no commercial value, suggesting that mineral extraction had become secondary to some other purpose. The theory emerged among researchers that the Blackwood brothers had been systematically searching for and exploiting natural formations that exhibited anomalous properties, using their mining operations as cover for investigations into phenomena that contemporary science could not explain. Internal company documents revealed that workers who reported unusual experiences in certain sections were quietly transferred or dismissed, with generous severance packages that included strict non-disclosure agreements, creating a culture of silence around the strange discoveries beneath the Kentucky mountains. Most damning was the discovery of a letter from Samuel Blackwood to his brother dated March 10, 1906, warning that the school teacher's investigations had gone too far and that exposing children to the deep chambers would have consequences. Though Victor's response dismissing these concerns as superstition demonstrated the fatal rift between the brothers' approaches to their terrible knowledge. The first public statement from a survivor in decades came in 1973, when Lily Ashford Coleman, then 73 years old and dying of cancer, agreed to be interviewed by folklore researcher Patricia Marquez, who had spent years investigating the Blackwood incident. The interview, conducted over 3 days at Mrs. Coleman's home in Richmond, Virginia, provided the first detailed account from any survivor about what had actually occurred in the mine's depths on March 15th and 16th, 1906. She described entering the cathedral room and witnessing her aunt's transformation as Margaret Ashford stood in the center of the vast chamber listening to something only she could perceive, her expression shifting from wonder to something Lily could only describe as hungry anticipation. According to her account, the teacher had announced that she could hear them calling and that they had been waiting so long for visitors and Ashais before leading most of the children through an opening in the chamber wall that Lily swore had not existed moments before. The 4 eventual survivors had hesitated at this threshold, some instinct warning them against following. When Foreman Brennan had grabbed his son and told the other three to stay close, that something was terribly wrong, and they needed to return to the surface immediately. Their flight through the passages became a nightmare of shifting geography, as tunnels they had traversed minutes before now led to different destinations, while behind them they could hear their teacher's voice calling for them to come back, that the others were learning such wonderful things, though the voice became less recognizably human with each repetition. Lily spoke of seeing things in their peripheral vision as they fled, shapes that moved along the walls and ceiling in ways that hurt to watch directly, and of passing chambers where they glimpsed their missing classmates standing motionless in darkness, their eyes reflecting their lamplight like nocturnal animals. The 2 days they spent trying to find an exit were punctuated by periods where reality seemed to fold in on itself, where they would walk for hours only to find themselves back where they started, until finally Thomas Brennan remembered ventilation shafts his father had shown him, and they were able to navigate by airflow to their eventual escape. She concluded the interview by stating her belief that her aunt and the other children were still alive somewhere in those impossible spaces beneath the mountain, learning things that human minds were never meant to comprehend. Modern geological surveys of the former Blackwood mine site have revealed natural cave systems of extraordinary complexity that extend far beyond what was known in 1906, lending credence to theories about the children becoming lost in unmapped passages. Teams of professional spelunkers exploring connected cave systems in the 1982nd and 1992nd reported finding numerous artifacts that appeared to date from the early 20th century, including leather shoe fragments, buttons from period clothing, and in one particularly disturbing discovery, a child's slate board with mathematical equations that gradually devolved into symbols that followed no known system. The acoustic properties of these cave systems have been studied extensively, revealing that certain chambers create sound phenomena that could explain reports of singing or voices, as wind moving through specific formations can produce tones that register in the range of human speech. Psychological analysis of the survivors' testimonies suggests that the combination of darkness, disorientation, and these acoustic phenomena could have triggered mass hysteria, causing the group to fragment and become lost in the cave system, while their traumatized minds created false memories to explain their experiences. Yet some discoveries resist easy explanation, particularly the 1987 find in a chamber that required specialized climbing equipment to access of 19 child-sized skeletons arranged in a perfect circle, though carbon dating indicated they had been placed there at least 3 centuries before any European settlement of Kentucky. The bones showed no signs of violence, but were positioned as if the children had simply sat down in a circle and never stood up again, their skulls tilted back as if looking at something above them, though the chamber's ceiling was solid limestone. Attempts to map the full extent of the cave system have been hampered by passages that seem to flood and drain unpredictably, by compass anomalies that make navigation difficult, and by the fact that no spelunking team has ever successfully retraced the route that should lead to the cathedral chamber described in the historical accounts. Modern ground-penetrating radar has revealed void spaces beneath the former mine site that shouldn't geologically exist, vast chambers that appear to have been carved rather than formed naturally, and, though no known indigenous culture in the region had the technology to create such spaces, leading to ongoing debates about their origin and purpose. The legacy of the Blackwood mine incident extends beyond the immediate tragedy to touch generations of Pike County residents who grew up with stories of the lost children and the teacher who led them into darkness. The former mine site, now owned by a holding company that maintains strict no trespassing policies, has become a focus for paranormal investigators and amateur explorers, despite the dangers posed by unstable ground and toxic gases that still seep from sealed shafts. Reports persist from those who venture near the site of hearing children's voices carried on the wind, particularly on March nights when atmospheric conditions match those of 1906. Though skeptics attribute these to acoustic phenomena and the power of suggestion, the 4 survivors' descendants have formed an informal network, sharing family stories and genetic health concerns that seem to disproportionately affect their bloodlines, including higher rates of claustrophobia, nyctophobia, and what one researcher termed specific phobia of subterranean spaces that manifest even in family members who were never told about their ancestors' experiences. Local historians have documented at least 43 people who have gone missing in the vicinity of the old Blackwood property since 1906, though most are attributed to mine subsidence, natural cave hazards, or simple misadventure rather than any supernatural cause. The town of Harlan Springs itself never recovered from the economic and psychological blow of losing so many children at once, gradually emptying until by the 1,962 only foundations and the cemetery remained. Though even these ruins seem to repel visitors with what paranormal investigators describe as an oppressive atmosphere of grief that hangs over the valley like fog. In 2006, for the centennial of the tragedy, a memorial was erected in the county seat rather than at the mine site itself, listing the names of the 19 children and Margaret Ashford who never returned, though the ceremony was marred by the discovery that morning of fresh child-sized footprints leading from the sealed mine entrance to the memorial site, despite security cameras showing no one had approached either location during the night. Modern analysis of the incident has produced various theories, ranging from the mundane suggestion of carbon monoxide poisoning, causing hallucinations and disorientation, to more esoteric proposals about dimensional rifts, temporal anomalies, or contact with pre-human intelligences, though none fully explain all the documented evidence. The question of why Margaret Ashford led the children away from safety continues to provoke debate, with some arguing she suffered a psychotic break triggered by whatever she had discovered in her solo explorations, while others point to her diary's suggestion that she had made contact with something that promised knowledge beyond human comprehension. The Blackwood Mining Company records, sealed for decades and only partially released through Freedom of Information requests, hint at Victor Blackwood's belief that certain geological formations served as gateways to what he termed adjacent realities, where the laws of physics operated differently, though whether this was delusion or discovery remains uncertain. The fate of the 19 children and their teacher haunts the American consciousness as one of those mysteries that resists resolution, where every answer leads to more disturbing questions, where the line between history and horror becomes indistinguishable, and where the darkness underground seems to hold secrets that perhaps were meant to remain buried. The mine entrances remain sealed behind concrete and steel, but local residents say that on quiet nights you can still hear them somewhere far below. 19 young voices reciting lessons in a language that predates human speech, following their teacher deeper into the dark, still learning things that no living person should know.